Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Braitch, and this is the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I am an emotional health and leadership coach and co-founder of the not-for-profit Seen and Heard, which supports those seeking healing, connection, and systemic change. My vision is to move myself and the world around me towards connection and compassion. And each week, I will connect with amazing guests who are on their journey to bring about meaningful change in their own lives and the world around them. Thanks for being here. Let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I have the great joy today to be joined by Alex Renton. Alex Renton attended Ashdown House, Eton College and Brighton College. He has worked throughout his career as a print and broadcast journalist, earning multiple awards for war reporting, investigative journalism and food writing. He has published 4 books, including Blood Legacy, which explores his family's history as enslavers in the Caribbean and its ongoing impact, and Stiff Upper Lip, which explores his family's history and cover-ups. Sorry, got mixed up there. And Stiff Upper Lip, which examines the culture, crimes and cover-ups within Britain's traditional private schools. His 2 radio series on these issues, In Dark Corners, are available on BBC Sounds. His 5th book, focusing on the history of systemic child sexual abuse and how it can be prevented today, is due to be published later this year. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, Chris. Great to be here.
It's lovely to connect. Thank you for making time. And this has been a podcast I've been really looking forward to recording for a long time. Actually, we've been circling around it for a while, haven't we?
Yeah.
And I think I often say at the beginning of the podcast, kind of how we connected. But for anyone listening, Alex was one of the first people I was connected to at the very start of Seen and Heard by Piers Cross, and you've been an enormous help. Support, guidance, all the way through sort of advocate support for what we've been doing. So a big thanks for that, and thank you for your work to support others.
Thank you.
Beautiful. So let's start the podcast with going back to the beginning and kind of getting to know you a little bit more and how you came into the work you're now doing. So just sharing anything, Alex, from your formative years, from growing up. Obviously, we heard about the schools you attended in the bio there at the start. But yeah, just anything that you felt really shaped what you're doing now.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And also thanks so much. I'm so admiring of the work you do. And I mean, literally, only yesterday I was writing emails to survivors because I get a lot of incoming email going, you need to talk to Seen and Heard, and particularly people who want to campaign and want to change things today, not just help look at their own past and the troubles at schools. Yeah, where do I come from? I think, it's kind of annoying, isn't it, that school is so much a part of the person I am today. I think if we were normally educated, that wouldn't actually be the case. School is an incidental, but no, I think, my schooling, traditional, posh, elite boarding schools, and my suffering in those, certainly in my prep school, is very much what I am today, and both my emotional makeup and my career, and I think for me a huge amount of what I am now starts on a wintry day in the maths teacher's classroom when I was just turning 9 at Ashdown House, when he sexually assaulted me and gave me a sweet, and really I think I'm never really in denial about it, but what came from that, and particularly in the bullying I suffered when I complained about it, the bullying by the headmaster, turned me into someone very anti-authority. I was a very angry teenager. I got myself deliberately expelled from Eton, and then into a sort of the kind of journalist who. I've been very privileged, very lucky to be able to, challenge authority through my life. That comes direct from that instinct then. And of course, that story of Ashdown House, which, now turns out to be, a net, one of many schools where you can see huge systemic failings, some of them deliberate, led me like 10 years ago to when another group of Ashdown pupils a couple of years younger than me, started a civil case against the school over their sexual abuse, to write for the first time for one of my regular magazine outlets. And from that came a whole load of, it was really a one-off piece about what happened in those schools and how, this is a cultural phenomenon, not just isolated incidents, which kind of everyone in our class knows. And that led to a whole load of work, which I had really not planned and which continues to this day.
Thank you for sharing, Alex. It's heartbreaking. You would tell the story of your prep school, 9 years old, and what happened. It's just, yeah, and the culture that surrounds it. You say when you step forward and spoke up, the bullying then from the headmaster.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand how that shaped the sort of the rebel, the teenager, and the challenging authority. As part of it, I hear a lot about kind of affluent neglect or privileged abandonment. And obviously, your amazing book, Stiff Upper Lip, is a sort of a bit of a bible for many on this. The kind of the cultural stuff that shapes the schools. Could you talk into a little bit about what it was like in the sort of main in these schools, and kind of how the cultures were put together when you came through?
I mean, I think, I did dig deep into this with a book I published about 10 years ago, Stiff Upper Lip. Suffering is good for you. It's the core principle, and it comes out of, some Christian beliefs around spare the rod and spoil the child, and, or the inherent evil of children, which some Catholic sects would say. And clearly, by the time you get to the late 1960s, when I went to boarding school, that formula of early separation from love and safety, and the toughening up, the reattaching of the child to the class or to the schoolhouse or whatever, was seen as a magic recipe for producing great empire builders and runners and so on, even though the empire had gone by that point, and perhaps wasn't as great as we believed. But so I kind of see the sexual abuse, which was, it's fairly clear from the 1880s onwards that, was rife and tolerated as part of that wider thing, which said you need to be beaten, you need to have no central heating, and you need to have terrible food. I mean, there is another thing going on in the culture. So we were abused in many ways, neglected at best, and certainly I've always try in this work, conscious that many of the people I've spoken to who had a terrible time that damaged them at prep school were not sexually abused. The psychological abuse can be just as damaging or more. So, and the culture of collusion, and I do think parents colluded. That's clearly there as well. My mother is still alive, and she we've talked this through. But I mean, I did complain to her, which is unusual. Most victims of child sexual abuse don't complain for decades, but I did tell her, and she went to the headmaster or the headmaster's wife and was talked out of taking it any further. That obviously compounds the survivors' anger and unhappiness when they do the right thing, and children are always trying to do the right thing, but children believe in justice, and when justice doesn't come that way, that's another hugely traumatizing effect. But it was interesting. I think when I speak to my mother now, she said, well, the headmistress tells me you look at this lovely place, your child was obviously lying. Children make things up, they're dirty-minded. And I think, and my father, who's now dead, who'd obviously been through the same education, told my mother that these things happen. They're normal. And I do remember my dad, when I went to that school, saying, don't let any of the older kids take you into the bushes. And you go, what a horrific thought. What he was referring to. But yeah, I mean, it's very, the parents colluded. Often they were too lazy to act when their children raised the red flags or begged for help. And the society tolerated it. And some of the grand people who ran those schools exploited that.
Well, thank you for sharing. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I went through in the late 80s and early 90s, and the sort of muscular Christianity stuff was still knocking around.
Yeah.
And the Children's Act in the 80s sort of outlawed the corporal punishment in schools of children, but the private sector hung on for another 10 years into the 90s, famously, to make sure they could keep dishing out this kind of good character forming stuff. And so, yeah, my first prep school, late 80s, I think that's was still beaten then. Fagging was still around, and there was still the warnings, backs to the wall when so and so's around, or it was endemic from probably the 50s until the noughties, and then it seems to, in our work, we see have morphed into something less overt within the system and less, let's say, teacher on young boy or young girl, and more kind of really deeply inappropriate relationships between pupils of different ages, like real imbalances of power, or schools claiming things like the staff are having relationships,
Yes.
with old, let's say 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old girls and boys, and considering them to be sort of okay, okay relationships, which is the St. Christopher's stuff that's in the press at the moment, in April 26th. So, yeah, it's remarkable how endemic it was. But when you say to create good empire building folk who are emotionally detached and can go anywhere in the world and mete out any sort of management or punishment or whatever is required, it's a Spartan theory, but it sadly made sense to, I guess, the people who built that system.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, what's key, and we should remember this today because, there are still children boarding, is that this notion of sending the children so early. I mean, lots of societies separate children at puberty or afterwards, traditionally or whatever. No society does it before puberty. And this is long before puberty. I've got cousins who went at 6 or 7 years old. And that's, there's no psychologist who then or now would back that as being remotely wise or helpful. But that, that notion that it's okay still remains entrenched. I mean, there are far fewer early boarders, as you call them, than there were. But I've spoken to headmasters, as I'm sure you have. You're in touch with some of the schools who off the record will go, I know that no child should go before 11, but how am I going to pay the bills if I refuse them? And it remains, that pernicious notion that children at that age and at later don't need utterly trustworthy support, unconditional love, available when they need it. And having, brought up 2 children myself at home, I know, well, they need it to this day. But those bottom line factors are really important. And I do think we have to be careful in this work that the criminal abuse, the stuff that gets the headlines, often blots out the fact of the psychological, the emotional abuse that is neglect and permitting the trauma of broken attachment.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I think that's something we try and advocate for quite a lot, is that understanding of the ABCD, the joy shadowing, abandonment, bereavement, captivity, dissociation, in it, whether it's a children's home, whether it's a boarding school, whatever it might be. And
it's a good point, Chris. Because also I think Joy Shavarian's, in respect to her for coining boarding school syndrome and so on, and writing, the best academic book of all. She there's very little sexual abuse mentioned in that book. I mean, the case studies that remain, drilled into your head are about guilt and fear and low level unhappiness and lack of trust and and the children's desperate attempts to adapt, those splitting of personalities and so on. Those issues are still with us, as they are in the state sector, where yesterday's newspapers reporting how there are there are 80,000 children not sleeping at home, or people who love them tonight, and more of them in unregistered children's homes because this sector has collapsed.
My God, that's heartbreaking. Yeah, and I think, as you say, that it is so pernicious, is your word. It gets deep into you. I mean, for me, there's a block of my first 2 years at prep school from 7 to 9 years old that I don't remember at all. So I
Yes,
don't know what happened in those years. I know I
yes,
was uncomfortable. I hated it. I was lonely, all these things, but I also shut down fairly quickly,
yeah,
because I'd had quite a lot of trauma before I went to boarding school. And that's often now starting to be mentioned more, almost this boarding school family syndrome, where you've got generational trauma, or as
yeah,
you said, it was
yeah.
just the way you did things. I think, what are you, sort of sixth, seventh generation boarding or
Yeah, yeah, and I think on my mother's side, the 1745 was the first one, and he ran away from school.
really?
Yeah, at 16 to join the army.
My goodness, my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, it shapes the entire family system. And, you're talking about parenthood. I've got, two teenage girls. I didn't see any loving attachment or caring, any sort of appropriate touch around during my childhood.
Mm.
And so I found parenting absolute,
Yeah.
absolute nightmare. I mean, how have you found your healing, if you like, and your parenting and your relationships?
Well, I think that's a really important point. I mean, but I mean, my parents were loving. I believe they loved us. I think they were kind of trapped by their culture, and they were loving to each other. So in many ways, I had a good childhood. But I do reject the notion that they brought me up.
Mm.
They didn't. They farmed it out to strangers from when I was 8.5, and yeah. So I mean, I was never going to send my children to boarding school. Uh, but I'm my wife is a psychotherapist for children and adolescents, so I owe an awful lot to her for telling me how to do it well. And I remember quite early on, learning things that anger is not a tool with young children or even with older children. I don't think I knew that. I thought anger is a tool. Anger is a reasonable thing to do.
Mm.
Shouting at children.
Mm. Shame as
But
well. Really.
it's
Mm.
I hope they I don't know. I hope they think I did a decent job. But we'll always regret these things. But yeah, we're innocent. We didn't have models of parenting that we'd learned.
Mm.
It wasn't done to us.
Mm.
But
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. And so in that we touched on empire. The sort of the system that was building people to go out and work in this. And in the intro, we talked about blood legacy.
yeah.
Your kind of your own familial history with the colonial ways. Just tell us a little bit about blood legacy and what rabbit hole you went down to understand that.
Yeah, so I mean, thanks. I do kind of like writing difficult books. After I'd written about the boarding schools thing, but about 2017, I was staying with family in rural Scotland, and I was digging around in the basement where my grandparents' house it had been, and I spent a lot of family holidays there, and I was digging around in the basement. My grandfather was always working on the family papers. He wasn't available, and I was digging around in the catalogue he wrote, and I kept seeing the words Jamaica and Tobago. And this is the Ferguson clan. I mean, and they've been wealthy for 300 years, and I don't think any of us had really asked where the wealth had come from, other than rent, tenants, and of course, like so many in the mid 18th century, particularly in Scotland, they piled in, bought estates and African enslaved people, and it was an amazing. I was really lucky. This is an amazing record just buried there, and I thought I've got to tell this story,
Mm.
and I went and I did something which kind of no one had done. I mean, that's happened now. Is actually go to Jamaica and Tobago and ask the people living on this land what they thought and what they thought of me and what I should do and today and how this story affected them. So half of the book is that, and it's kind of interesting because I published it in 21 in the aftermath of the rise of Black Lives Matter here, and it could have made much more of a splash than I expected. Really aggressive from the right wing about and sadly some members of the family. But it's interesting because I think I was the drive, I mean, there was no money in it because I obviously I had to give the money away because I couldn't make a profit from enslavement again. So, and it was quite a lot of work. But I think, I think what I did emerged from my boarding school story was a sort of, certainly my journalism, particularly reporting conflicts, an interest in victims and supporting victims and justice around that. And I think that's probably why I did that book. But you do kind of cause yourself more trouble than you need. But it's been good. But I mean, and I think what's been great is we now have an organisation called, if anyone's interested, called heirsofslavery.org. And we encourage, and there are a lot of others, people to come forward who want to look at that history, perhaps want to make some apology, perhaps pay some money, perhaps even to help, some of my family pay for scholarships and things like that. Token. But it is all part of addressing racism today and the things that divide us today. But man, it makes people angry. It's amazing. The attacks on that. I mean, the right wing were quite nice about my attacking the boarding school system, but the Spectator and the Telegraph and so on have been very angry about the notion that Britain wasn't entirely the good guys in this story.
Yeah,
which is kind of fun. I mean, I enjoy that kind of conflict.
Ever the rebel, Alex. I love it. But I was blown away by the book, by you following that story, and I think for me that we're in a turning point, and I can see it. Over the last 30, 40 years, we are on an upswing. It's not as fast as I would like. It's not as far as I would like, but I can feel the world moving, and we've had more sort of scandals exposed in the last 5 years than probably in the 30 years before that. It's just one after another of blood scandal and post offices and Harrods and boarding schools and churches and scouts, etc. It's one after another. I think there is a growing lack of tolerance to cover up. And your word will stick with me. We're a nation addicted to cover up. You could just explain that.
Yeah. No, it's a good phrase that, which I've used myself. No, I think I think you're absolutely right. I do hope that this is a long process to us becoming a happier, more comfortable, more honest nation, in which we tolerate and understand better. What I worry is the downside of it is no one believes anybody on anything any longer. You don't believe any rulers and so on, and that's clearly something going on more widely in the world. And it's when you get into some of the issues you and I have worked on together, particularly around trying to change the law to make children safer today, and you look at how poorly government, and dishonestly sometimes government has acted in trying to answer those very reasonable requests, you do despair. But we have got to keep some faith in some way of organizing ourselves for the common good. And one's tendency as a journalist, an investigative journalist, is to rip down everything. And as Harold Evans, the great Sunday Times editor, said, the first question in any journalist's mind approaching someone in authority is to say, why is the fucking bastard fucking lying to me? But we can't just destroy and take things apart. So, I mean, that kind of, I look at my children growing up and I want them to believe in something, and so anyway, that's going off the subject, but yeah,
I hear you. I guess because I'm quite idealistic, as you know. For me, there is a move to sort of a people power, community-based change, and some of the work that you've done. For instance, we've collaborated and crossed paths a lot around your work with Edinburgh Academy survivors, with the Justice Group, Giles Moffat and Nikki Campbell, and all the amazing people up there, Neil and others. Because I see that group doing big things to change. We're going after Wares now in South Africa for extradition, getting justice for people. So could you speak a little bit about your support of kind of people power in this area and helping galvanize?
Yeah, so that's been great. I mean, and I think the EA, the other Scottish survivors in that group is a particularly good example of where this work comes out well. So, I mean, the background for me in that is so I've been since I first started writing about the boarding schools, and I had huge incoming email from people who say, often looking for help, and and I pass them on to therapy or therapeutic outlets or people or seen and heard or whatever first, but I do keep a database where I log every complaint and the names of the alleged abusers, and I keep that in confidence. And from that comes I help journalists, and often I get requests from the police or from lawyers or trying to put cases together. And that's really the genesis of the Edinburgh Academy Feta Ian Ware's stuff. But that specifically because I made a radio series where we named that some of those people, some of those criminals, and the schools, and then Nicky Campbell heard that series and obviously took it up himself and gave it much more impact and impetus. And it's a particularly egregious case in terms of the number of survivors. But it's also not unusual in terms of the cover-ups, and they're really very, very normal. They're just, and that's why we did the radio series, because we were tracking teachers through various schools. And just to show how endemic the cover-up system was. But there are dozens of others, and some of whom have had a lot of publicity as well. But including my own school. But it's great to see to empower people who have suffered either overtly or covertly, because often people hide it, and to say the main thing that I think I do with my database and responding to emails from people say you are not alone. And I can not only are you not alone because hundreds of thousands of people went through a miserable time in these schools, but you're not alone because I've got 3 other reports from your school, and if you like, subject to confidentiality, I can help you guys get together, and that's the way to take your look for redress, officially or unofficially. So that's really productive. I mean, the downsides are it's time consuming. It can be re-traumatizing. Often we in our 50s or 60s are going, I still want the adults to listen to me and do the right thing. And when the school writes back going, we're terribly sorry, but it was a different institution then and we've got no responsibility. People are re-traumatized just as they were when the head teacher failed to listen to them back 40 years earlier. But, I think the survivors, groups like that, and Nikki and Giles have forced the system to act better. Police are so much better than they were 20 years ago, and in most, not all of them, but in most forces. We could do a top 10 of good police forces and bad ones, but and so those are all productive. I mean, I do kind of tend to. There's a problem when people disclose, and often break ingrained rules about being silent and being tough about this and stiff upper lip. It's very exciting. I'll go to the media, I'll tell them everything, and then at last, everything will be put right. And then it doesn't happen. I mean, you can get a smash in the media and then nothing happens. And so I always say to people, get the therapy first. That's the only thing we know has a chance of really working. But and there are huge levels of frustration. There are an awful lot of people, and some of them who've kind of given up, and friends who spent 20 years trying to get changes in the law who just given up trying to do it. For obvious things that would keep children safe today, and so it's a tough area. But in the end, you go. I think if I looked at all the emails over the years, and I've got 1,700 entries in that database, and that's just mainly criminal or egregious acts. By and large, the majority, it's been positive. If only it was because people write to you 3 years later going, I never responded, but after our email exchange, I told my wife, I told my husband, and we got therapy, and my children understand why. Now I understand a bit more, and actually my life has changed, and thank you. And in a way, that's just as pleasing as the other email, which I sent you one, which I got this morning, going, at last my teacher has been charged and he's been in court on next month.
Yeah.
Just as pleasing, actually.
Yeah.
Because as you said earlier, that the collateral damage is huge. Generation crossing. The children who don't understand why dad drank so much and was emotionally unavailable. The wives who've worked all their lives, so partners, to keep marriages going, in the face of, someone in denial about, why they actually might have some underlying problems.
Mm.
Women and men. I mean, a good third of the people I hear from are women.
Yeah, as that's very important. That what tends to happen sometimes with the papers is it goes for the headline sort of juicy abuse story, excuse the language, but that's what they kind of go for. But what's underneath that is the neglect bit being missed. It's the privileged abandonment. It's the voice of women's experiences and girls' experiences in schools often, but they are coming through more and more now, which is. It has to happen. It has to be part of it. And the St. Christopher's case that's out there at the moment is very much there around those deeply inappropriate relationships that were happening, and schools being permissive of this.
Yeah, and that's so important. I mean, the wide range of things. I mean, I had an email from someone this week talking about school much more recently, and the issue was around the sharing of pornography on a mobile phone between pupils, and the trauma that came from that. And it's but yeah, pupil on pupil abuse. But I think the chorus, one of the most coruscating things that we, the psychotherapists do understand this, but everyone needs to understand this, is guilt and self-blame, and that long-term thing of so many people who blocked out what happened because they were supposed to have been happy, or mummy and daddy said how hard we've worked and you're going to have a great time. And then, the awful way that some of the adult abusers used that, and I always, always go back. No one should say they were lucky in their abuse, but I'm lucky that I had no affection for my abuser. He was just a hateful man I was frightened of. Those who were groomed and, because needy children and lacking love, to feel love and responsibility will suffer really badly with a sense of confusion and guilt forever. And that's, therapy, please.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Alex. It's something we talk to people about is, yes, there is a criminal complaints process, a civil complaint. You can, apply to victims of crime, but underneath it all is a healing path of that journey. And it's it's the classic sort of Matt Damon, Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting scene where he finally gets, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It still brings tears to me because I've supported hundreds of survivors over the last 3 years, either as a coach or in Seen and Heard. And almost to the person, there was, I should have, could have. I should have said more, should have fought back, could have done X. And letting go of that this was, maybe you froze because this was cataclysmic at that age. There was no way out. You survived. You did a bloody good job. You're here right now. You're an amazing human being, and it's time to put the blame where it belongs, which is a very, very
with the adults
person that hurt you, or a system.
Absolutely. I mean, that really the other corresponding side of that, which we both know, is people going, if only I'd complained back then he couldn't have gone on to abuse others. And there's some of the Edinburgh Academy, but survivors will say exactly that. But it's not your job as a confused, frightened, bruised, self-doubting child to do the job of the adults. It's the adults, and they're the ones who make me really angry. It's those grand entitled adults who covered up, and passed abusers on in full awareness of the risks they pose. They annoy me more than the molesters, most of them, who are sick and sad. There's some utter psychopaths there as well, but
But let's stay there, Alex, just for a second, because actually what opened the door to is just something where we those adults who are charged with care of young people, passing offenders on between institutions, etc. And if only there was a law such as mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse known and suspected, with a criminal sanction, with protection for whistleblowers. If only such a thing existed, we could protect children better. And you got me into the world of campaigning around mandatory reporting. It was you.
I apologise.
That's a poison. But there's something in the police and crime policing bill which will be through in a couple of months that's like a sort of chocolate teapot version that won't protect children. Without us becoming a mandatory reporting podcast, just tell us a little bit about your take on where we're at.
I think, it is a battle that we've lost for this generation, because this government that, ICSA pretty clearly, the English Child Abuse Inquiry, was one of their key recommendations. And it's essentially to make it a legal sanction, your failure to report suspicion or evidence of child sexual abuse to an outside authority should be a criminal act. And this law won't do it. It doesn't actually make things any different than they were before, because it's not legally sanctioned, which is something which works. And I think we've lost. I mean, the bill's in its final stages, as you said, and when it's not going forward, it's really depressing. I mean, but we need to move on. Because the arguments were very well put, and there are other issues. I mean, I'm just finishing a book for the same publisher who did Stiff Upper Lip, which should be out early next year. It's even less readable, I think. But it's an attempt to look at. It's an attempt to be hopeful. I'm going to go through some of the big scandals, including the over the years. I mean, not Jimmy Savile and so on, but more the ones that expose stuff in the system, particularly in psychology, which went wrong, and try to sort of arrive at these. Here's 10 things that we could do today in policy and so on, and there are other policy things. I mean, the prevention of child sexual abuse is something we really don't. We talk about safeguarding issues, and which obviously mandatory reporting is right, and you guys work on that, and so you should. But there is a proportion of the adult population who are sexually interested in children, and the way we tackle them as a society has got worse, not better. And there are clear changes that can be gone into there, and that's very much where I'm trying to go in this book. In the sense of going, these things are known to work. We could, they work in other countries. We could do them and stop children, particularly in institutions, being so at risk to sexual abuse by adults. Which seems to me, it's a multi-factored approach, but it is the kind of one we kind of ignore. Society's always been very bad about talking about why and how adults sexually aggress children, and we need to demystify it and understand it better. And the fact that the psychs say almost every person with an admitted attraction can be helped, in the sense that they never will commit an offence, a contact offence. But in the great pedo panic squabble, we forget that the real problem is the people who cover up for them, the managers who are too lazy or too bored to act on suspicions, and the fact that sexual attraction to children is a psychological disorder which can be treated.
Thank you. Yeah, we have to have that debate, because often as well, more often than not, someone who is sexually attracted to children or acts on that they are both committing an offence, or thinking about committing an offence, but they're also likely to be a victim of it themselves somewhere in their childhood as well. So
yes,
not always, but there is something in formative years. That is not something that just pops up out of the blue. There is something there.
That's absolutely right. And I had one of the most interesting things has been sitting in on counselling sessions for people convicted of sexual acts against children, sexual abuse of children, either online or IRL. And there are a lot of people in the very underfunded business of addressing that who are convinced that people's behavior can be changed and make them safe, but also that childhood abuse of trauma of some sort or other is a really common factor, not necessarily sexual, but it's and I think we can all recognize that. It's a very hard thing for survivors to hear, and I've spoken to survivors so horrifically frightened of their own sexuality as a result of what happened to them, and it's one of the most tragic things you can hear. But there's a clear psychological path to trying to deal with what happened to you as a child and make it okay to sexual offence against children yourself. But as you say, clearly not universal.
No, and just so touching on our country, because when we look at mandatory reporting, things like that, we look around the world and we look off to Australia and we look at Scandinavia and America and all sorts of places. What is it about mandatory reporting in this country? Some of the people you think would be incredibly supportive of that, who work perhaps with children or in social services, education, etc., are staunchly against it. What is it about the sort of British institution that is inherently scared of anything where we have to call things out or blow the whistle on things?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I have in the book kind of traced the history of rejection of MR. I mean, very early on, Simon Bailey, who's now retired, but who was the chief police officer in charge of child protection, literally said, "We can't afford it." Such a measure would produce so many nonsense reports or well, not offensive, what's the word? Malicious reports that policing and social services would be overwhelmed. And people like the NSPCC and social workers back that up. To which, people like Mandate Now, that, the very good campaign, and they told the child abuse inquiry, they said, well, you can look around the country and see introducing mandatory reporting tends to reduce the cost of investigating something, in the longer term. But it seemed that has been the root of it. And also in a kind of depressing, and I think this is really problematic. There is a depressing attitude, and I don't know if this is British or what, of you do hear it from social workers going, what you don't need to do is you need to support us, not question us. And I go, well, I can show you how social work was infiltrated by networks of people with sexual interest, members of the Paedophile Information Exchange, who I've done some reporting on. It's the bad actors inside your own house, in the common room at the school, in the social workers. Those are the people that we need to guard against, because there is a certain sort of adult who will deliberately infiltrate those organizations.
For me, you mentioned it a long time ago, that sort of this idea that children are kind of inherently either at best not important, not seen and heard, and at worst evil, and to spare the rod, spoil the child, etc. To me, when I look at other cultures around the world who worship children as being closer to God, closer to their original self, and that's my belief, is that I think we've sort of demonized children, and therefore children don't vote, children aren't important, they don't sort of contribute to the tax base, so they just got to sort of be put somewhere, stay out of harm's way until they're old enough to be useful. That's my view on something that is endemic.
No, I see. I mean, I'll send you the first couple of chapters of the new book. I mean, that's been really one of the most, for me, as a researcher, the most fun, in quotes, but the most fun thing has been researching 100 years of ignoring children. Really start, psychologically and criminologically, and you're starting with Freud. I mean, the great story of Freud's, which has screwed up known hundreds of thousands of children. Freud's reversal in 1886, going from many children are sexually abused, to saying, actually, I'm cancelling that idea. Many children make up stories of sexual abuse by adults, and that messed with the profession for really till the 1970s, if not beyond. And you can see, this appalling. The myth of the seductive child, the dishonest child, the child whose fault it is, not the adult's fault, and that appears again and again the endless government inquiries from the 1940s onwards into scandals in childcare, residential childcare, and there's some great academic work about it as well. But and that's added to the fact that our class, the boarding school using class, did not report it. So all the criminologists, even and the psychs, even those who cared, are going, well, this is an issue about the poor classes and the unwashed, the uneducated. It's poor, stupid children who get abused sexually. You go, no, it's universal, because we kept stum. And it really, it's not. Even though Eben Moore was kind of writing about it, I mean, even though the class knew, but the upper class did not admit that this was going on. But then, of course, you're at the other end of it, where I think if you ask the average Brit now about pedos, they go, an awful lot of people believe it's people of a different skin color who've recently arrived here, whereas the average sex offender against child is someone in their own home or who they know and trust personally.
Absolutely.
And that's been denied. That's always been true and always been denied as well. The stranger danger is a much, much happier myth.
Mm-hmm.
People are comfy with stranger danger and educating their children about it. What's much more difficult is it's your gym teacher or your uncle, but they're much more likely to actually sexually abuse a child. So the myths are still, we may be much more aware of the risks to children. I think we are. I'm concerned about it, but the myths are still screwing with public health policy.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, thanks for exploring that with me. I just wanted to sort of cover that sort of broader element of child protection and our view of children, and then just circle back a little bit. Talk about the list. 1,600 entries on this list, 10 years that you've supported those coming forward with signpostings and being heard.
Yeah.
And that list is something that you have taken all of the personal data out of, so it's fully confidential, and that we've spoken around that list. And you've got on there, you've got over 700 schools, 1,500-1,600 complaints, over 700 schools. The sort of 70s dense and the 1970s, but from the 60s, 80s, 90s, and up till recently, looking across there, I'm just sort of citing a couple of things. We've started to look at some of the, not the individual names, of course, but the schools involved. Third or more are kind of current Boarding School Association, IAPS or HMC members. And what we're seeing really is that when people are coming forward now, and we talk about a time bomb of complaints, because people are at an age now, it's 25 plus years on average to report abuse as a child. So people are of the right age now because of technology coming forward, better networks, more trauma-informed society, language. This bubble is just ever growing of people actually bravely coming forward. So that list is only set to, I would say, keep growing and going. But what are you seeing? So first question is, what are you seeing the institutions do in these situations? What's their modus operandi for when it hits the press or when people make complaints?
I mean, there is a playbook, and I think that there really is a playbook. I think Boarding Schools Association, provide sheets on how to handle historic abuse allegations. And I think there are good actors and bad actors here, but it's pretty clear that you can't admit liability because your insurers won't let you admit liability. So the best really a modern institution can do is go, we're really sorry, tell the police. We're sorry this happened to you, but it's not our fault. We'll tell the police and let's see what happens. When these, and the schools got slightly better at being less, it's obviously re-traumatizing and hurtful, particularly because, it's the brick mother, as Ernest Gombrich, the great sociologist, said, we looked to these people were our parents and we looked to them to behave well. But how these things tend to play out is nothing will happen without a criminal complaint. And and then often you still be a long way from an apology because the schools have changed, become charities, and they've changed their sort of. We've literally had schools that are the same name on the same building saying we're not the same school. I think I'll name Gordonston for saying that about its junior school because they really caused a lot of pain through doing it. But and we can justify that in court. But it really is all back in the hands of the insurers. I mean, but Ashdown House, my prep school when I was at, it's got many complaints against it in the 70s when I was there. Turns out they didn't have any insurers. And they were literally, we know they were quite broke, although pretty posh. I mean, they had the Queen's nephew started the same day as me, but they've had to admit to one of the lawyers firms you and I know that they no records of the insurers. But so this does throw it all on the insurance companies or their inheritors of the policies back then, which in a way, I'm a great encourager of people seeking compensation, which can be, can work quite well, particularly in Scotland, because you kind of go, if anyone's going to police these people, often small businesses, it's their insurance company going, we don't want to have to pay out, it's hundreds of thousands of pounds in Scotland. So that that is one of the ways it goes forward. But by and large, given those, you know more about this than me, Chris, really. But given those understandable constraints on the schools in terms of apology and so on, they could do a hell of a lot better. And there are schools like Edinburgh Academy, again, who have done a hell of a lot better. I mean, it's just amazing to me when Giles Moffat and that crew managed to find themselves lecturing the sixth formers at Edinburgh Academy with the headmaster what had happened to them and what should be done about it now. That was doable. But then up the road is Fettes College, which had the same problem in the same area with some of the same teachers, just putting up bullying survivors, issuing press briefings, denying what they've said, just putting up the fences as ever.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yeah, I mean, we say we've worked with a number of schools in this area, and we gave a presentation to the Boarding School Association about a month ago on compassionate and proactive alumni wellbeing. So just putting a full alumni wellbeing provision together, because the responsibility doesn't end at the school gates, if you like. You've been incredibly formative in someone's experiences, and even if it's not hardcore abuse, whatever you want to call it, specifically, they may well run into difficulties in life later on.
Yes.
So the school can provide wraparound care for that if they get it right, and that includes, of course, someone comes forward with a non-recent complaint, there is a good structure. So we're advocating that now. It's a very slow take up. There are some schools reaching out saying we want to get this right, we want to do this in a trauma-informed way, and really just unequivocally say you're sorry. Even the British Institute of Insurers and all the ecclesiastical and all this say, yep, you can apologise without any admission of liability. So just apologise completely. Don't say it was the last lot. Don't say everything's better now. Don't say any of these things that are going to hurt people. Just apologise, signpost them to wherever they want to go with lots of options, fund some therapeutic support whilst any sort of complaints going on. Don't pass people around in a school so they have to tell their story 3 or 4 times. Just have a designated lead on this who's trying to get it right. And for God's sake, don't stonewall people. Believe them, because if they're 60 and they're coming to you, they've lived with this their whole life, and they do not need to be disbelieved again. So it's basics, but that's going to take a while getting out there. And as you've said, good actors and the bad actors are causing a real amount of harm in this.
No, absolutely. And as we said already, it's not just harm to the survivor, to the ex-pupil. It's their family need this closure. Their children need this closure. Need to understand and and move forward. But I mean, it's kind of interesting because I mean, you and I know many of the names on because you've got your own lists and so on those lists of allegations. And I could tell you now, I could go I can give you a list of schools, grand schools still in place that I have got it coming down the road to them. I mean, there's a very famous one in Oxfordshire, shall I say, that I'm amazed that they haven't been done. There are so many complaints, and they're awful complaints. And, they really should be getting on their game now, because they have they have huge, nasty publicity coming that way.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I will say that, our discussions with the BSA, David there, he has brought us in to help advise on the next revision of the guidance on handling non-recent complaints that will go out to their
Good.
members. And that, for me, I see a willingness to engage on some of this stuff now. I'm sad it's taken this long. I wish it could go further, but I will acknowledge that there is a dialogue there. The challenge they've actually got, and this is quite genuine, is that members, because of that kind of institutional arrogance, are a law unto themselves.
Yeah.
A governing body can give as much guidance as they want, but if the schools go, yeah, all right, then it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult, and there is a lot of sort of institutional arrogance in this area.
No, yeah, and also, I mean, some of the smaller schools, they're closing left, right, and centre at the moment because of financial pressures. Though I have to say, in some of the cases, you go good, frankly, because I don't think particularly small schools catering to younger boarders there's any reason to trust them now better than today, because things can always go wrong and cover-ups happen automatically, particularly in an institution that's under pressure financially. Which is the lesson we have to say to parents now, considering that kind of insanity.
Thank you, Alex. So just as our time running short today, I know you've got another appointment coming up. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I love speaking to you. Is there anything you feel like we haven't touched on that you would like to put out there?
No, not really. I mean, I do think, I think it's interesting because, I'm just completing this new book, and I'm really not trying to sell it like people do in podcasts, because I don't know why anyone would buy it, but it's just, but it's I really want to have hope. And I do think there are we as campaigners, or we as the general public, there are changes that can happen, and I'm going to list them in the book, and I'll do some journalism, I hope, around it as well, which can be got. And I think in many ways you and I are having this conversation. Seen and Heard exists. We are in a better place even than 10 years ago. And there has been a change in the culture. That it's not, for men like you and I, from the class background we have, it's now, and women, obviously, it's not too shameful to speak up. I've got an old, he's not a friend, but he was at my prep school. He's now the Provost of Eton, Sir Nicholas Coleridge, former editor of Harper's and Queen magazine. And he is in charge of one of the great, the grandest of all the schools ever. And he's come out and said, named the teachers. And funnily enough, they're the same two teachers who abused me at our prep school as well. I haven't seen him make any other changes, but it's now acceptable for Sir Nicholas, the Provost of Eton, to write in the Daily Mail about how he was abused at school by two men who abused many others. Big change. And that's good for society. But I think I always say this to you, Chris. I mean, finally, let's not forget the children in care. Many more, 80, 90,000. There's only 60,000 boarders or something now. We need to take we're articulate. We're connected. We have ways of getting change. We can afford therapy. We need to stand up for them and so on, because that system is worse than it's ever been.
Important final thought there. Thank you. Yeah, for me, this is, the children raised in institutions away from love, connection, appropriate touch. We can't go on in what we call civilization now. And for me, it's about a great disconnection. A great disconnection that's happened that is now starting to turn around. So part of that reconnection is what we've spoken about today. So speaking up, reaching out, finding community, finding healing, whether that be in groups, with therapists, etc., and speaking out, whether that's criminal, civil, getting in contact with Alex as well. So if you have experienced abuse, and you want to speak in confidence about it, Alex has got this list. You can contact him via his website. You can contact us at Seen and Heard and seek support, whether it be therapeutic groups, etc. But as we finish off, Alex, I just want to say a big thank you from personally, and for all the work that you've done for for survivors over the years, for getting this on the radar, and not giving up. That Rebels, you've done a great job, so thank you.
Oh, thanks, Chris. That's really kind. No, I'm really happy. People at contact at alexrenton.com. I mean, what I can do specifically is say if I got records of your school and then log yours. I mean, I'm not a therapist. I try to not have conversations. Email's better for me. But if you there are other really useful forms of help, I'll tend to just pass you back to Chris and seen and heard. And in response to you, well done you for what you've set up. In the years I've been working in this, the most effective survivor support organisation I've seen yet. I mean, there are others and they're good, but you given the range of what you do, and I think you've done absolutely brilliantly. And the schools need to listen to you and learn from you.
Thank you, Alex. Fingers crossed they will at some point. And I know you said, we've missed an opportunity for mandatory reporting, but I'm not standing down for the barricades yet. So when that comes into the police and crime bill, we can start campaign and lobbying to hang amendments on it and get that beefed up over time. So it's not...
Laws can be amended. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, there's a bit of work there, but thank you so much, everyone, for listening, for being with us today. If you've been affected by anything we've spoken about, please do get in touch with Alex, with ourselves. You're not alone, as Alex said. You will be believed, and this is all part of a healing, within ourselves and within our society as well. So thank you, Alex Renton.
Thank you, Chris.
We'll see you on the next episode of the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. Bye for now.